So, without further ado, Mr. Hugh Dellar.
Thank you. It's quite weird being referred to as Mr. Hugh Dellar. I feel I'm going to have my teeth taken out or something. Hello. I feel slightly awkward after the last talk. I feel like I should be miming the introduction to my talk. I'm going to be talking about student speaking, and I'm Hugh Dellar. As someone who basically sort of shambles around with their hands in their pockets quite a lot, I feel sort of slightly inappropriate to be following on from that talk. Hello, I'm Hugh Dellar. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer based in North London, and a course book writer and a methodology book writer. And what I'm going to be talking about and kind of getting you to think about a bit more really is kind of what we do as teachers when students are speaking, and whether there are other things we could be doing to kind of help us get more from student speaking. Because I don't know about for you, but for me, I think student speaking was something I took for granted for a long time. A lot of the student speaking I did in my early kind of teaching career was basically grammar practice. I look back on my own early years as a teacher sort of ruefully really, because I think a lot of the time I wasn't really talking to the students as individuals. I was basically talking to them in order to see whether they could say 3 trees correctly, or whether they could use the present perfect correctly, or whether they could sort of be correct manipulators of form and function actually. And as a result, I think I wasn't probably talking to them enough as human beings. And then when I was talking to them enough as human beings, I think possibly I went through a stage where I was overly talking to them as human beings and not thinking about them enough as language learners. And I think there's a sort of strange tightrope we often have to walk as language teachers, where we need to deal with the students as people first and foremost, but we also need to deal with them as people who've paid to come to us to improve primarily, I think, actually their spoken language. So what we're going to be looking at is sort of basic ideas about things that we can be doing before, during and after student speaking to try and get more from the whole experience. And I wanted to begin really just with some sort of basic beliefs that I have about speaking. And the first one is maybe stating the obvious, but I think it's quite a sort of important thing to bear in mind, which is, in a way, speaking is the one thing that students can't really practice at home. Students can sit and work their way through Murphy's Grammar in Use, through vocabulary, self-study books, through all kinds of things at home. But I think actually the way we judge people's competence in a foreign language is primarily through their ability to speak. I'm sure you've all had those students come to you who are great on paper, do well in the written sort of entrance tests. They can write quite well, they can read quite well, but their speaking is basically pre-intermediate. And I think a lot of people want to know the kind of secret to how can I improve my speaking. As someone who's quite active on social media, I get a lot of emails and messages through kind of saying, you know, how can I improve my speaking? And people want you to be able to give them some sort of magic bullet that's going to solve these problems. But I think the reality is that first and foremost, as with all skills actually, but you know, it needs stating with speaking, students don't get better at speaking just by speaking. If that was the case, they could all just bugger off to the pub and not bother coming to class and sit and talk to each other. Of course, some students do try this particular approach. Some teachers also on occasion. But I think the real way that you get better at speaking is primarily by learning more language. And as a result, I think what it means in terms of classroom speaking is that classroom speaking should be something that we look at as teachers as an opportunity for teaching, okay? It's basically a way for us to find out what students can do already, where gaps might be in their language, where we might be able to help them say things better. And that basically speaking in the classroom is an opportunity for us to provide feedback and to provide input to help them speak better next time that they come to have a conversation or to express a particular idea around a similar theme or topic to the one that they've just been trying to speak about. So basically I think student speaking is primarily an opportunity for us as teachers to teach something new to the students that we're working with. I think also it's worth thinking about the kinds of speaking that we do in class. If you read the Common European Framework, if you're desperate for a way to sleep at night and you've run out of sleeping tablets, there's a wonderful book you can engage with. There's a very interesting statement quite early on in the book, which is that the reasons that students are learning a foreign language, whatever European foreign language it happens to be, is because primarily what they need to be doing with their speaking is three things. They need to be dealing with the business of everyday life in a foreign country and helping foreign people in their own country deal with the business of everyday life. They need to be exchanging ideas, thoughts, feelings and opinions with other young people. And they need to be using their spoken language to develop their understanding of other cultures, other ways of life, other ways of thinking. And I like these ideas. I think they're quite noble ideas. I know it's unfashionable in this current day and age to admire anything that's come out of Europe, but I think this is quite a kind of a sensible idea. And it's also a sort of filter, I think, with which teachers can view the kinds of speaking that they're asking students to do. When I look back at a lot of the early speaking I used to ask my own students to do, basically it was none of these things. It was essentially they're doing the speaking in order to practice the grammar. It might have been something like, pizzas versus Paris, where the students sit and discuss in pairs why Paris is better than pizzas, and then the other person spends 3 minutes saying why pizzas are better than Paris, and then we do loads of punitive correction on comparative forms. And that kind of speaking, I think, is still rife in English language teaching. I'm sure we've all been guilty of imposing that kind of stuff on our students over the years. And it's hard to look at that kind of speaking and to argue that it helps students do any of these three particular things, except possibly in a very abstract kind of maybe comparatives one day might help them do some of these things perhaps kind of way. So I think it's worth looking at these things and just thinking about, does this relate to the kind of speaking that I'm asking my students to participate in? And I think, as I said, speaking needs to be more than just form manipulation. Speaking needs to be personally meaningful. Speaking where relevant, and I'm not saying always, but I think where relevant, it needs to be relatively free. And we need to ensure that there's space in the speaking that we're asking students to do in class for the students to try and bring their own meanings and their own messages to the classroom. And as we'll see, I think sometimes that means that they'll kind of overreach. Sometimes it means we might need to teach things that are above level, because those are the things that students are trying to say while we're engaging them. So these are my sort of basic beliefs about speaking. I think one of the real problems with speaking is, as I'm sure again you're all aware, it's the kind of leading the horse to water and then watching it not drink kind of problem. It's easy to provide opportunities for students to speak, but making sure that students actually participate in the speaking is often something completely different. A lot of students, I think, just don't see the point of speaking tasks, especially when they're done in pairs or in groups. I'm sure you've all had students who complain about, I want to talk to you, teacher. They want to be in this sort of lockstep relationship with you, oblivious to the fact that they haven't paid for a one-to-one class, which are available if they wish to purchase them. But basically, that's what they see as being beneficial, because they don't want to sit and learn the mistakes of other students, which is how they'll often see what the speaking's for. A lot of students also just want to move on to the learning tasks, or what they believe the learning tasks to be, as quickly as possible. I was teaching a Chinese guy a couple of years ago, and he basically never participated in speaking in class. And we did a tutorial, and I was sort of suggesting this might be a problem, and asking him why he didn't sort of participate more. And he said, I'm only going to start speaking when I make no mistakes. And he had this sort of bizarre idea that he was somehow going to kind of master the language in his mind first, and that once he'd done that, he'd sort of emerge fully formed as this beautiful butterfly and sort of, fly around speaking perfect English. And it was really difficult kind of persuading him that it just doesn't work like that. That's not how the process actually occurs. Sometimes I think there may just be personal reasons why students don't want to speak on particular days or on particular topics, or possibly in certain contexts with particular other students. There may be background stuff going on that we just don't know about sometimes. Having said all of that, I still think that the bigger failure for student non-speaking when we present them with opportunities lies either in the actual material that we're giving the students, in the task that we're offering them, or in the kind of preparation, the groundwork that we provide as we're leading up to the speaking, or of course in a sort of combination of the two, and if it's a combination of the two, it's particularly deadly, I think. It's sort of guaranteed to result in non-speaking. I think sometimes it may just be the case that there are too few questions that we're giving students. The students kind of race through it. They operate on a sort of minimum effort principle of who can say the least correctly and get to the end of the speaking before, anyone else in the class, and therefore win some kind of imaginary medal. Sometimes I think the speaking is just too obvious and the students don't see the point in it. So, these kind of activities like say what's in the picture. You're sitting there with someone and you're both looking at a picture and the teacher tells you, describe the picture. It's like, well, it's there. What else do you want me to say about this? Sometimes I think also, particularly if you're teaching non-European students, and I don't know how many of you get a lot of students from outside the sort of mainstream European ELT markets or have worked in those kind of markets, students will often just not have sufficient life experience, sufficient cultural experience, socio-historical, political kind of background to discuss things that, the course books are expecting them to teach. Don't know if any of you ever taught from the old Headway Advanced, discuss what you know about the fall of communism. Good luck doing that with like Indonesian teenagers in the mid-1990s, because the answer is nothing. Sometimes I think there's the kind of opposite problem where the task is almost too open and students are just unclear what they're supposed to say, or the task requires too much imagination, too much creativity to be done spontaneously. Headway was also classic for that on occasion. There'd be things like, discuss in pairs, in what way is life like a jigsaw? And you're like, Jesus, there's always one piece missing. What do you want from me here, teacher? And in these kind of situations, I think, students just often don't see the point because it doesn't relate to their reasons for learning language. It doesn't necessarily obviously relate to language that you've already studied. It's hard for them to see how this kind of threads into the general thrust of what you're trying to do as a teacher. Going to just look at some different things that teachers can do, okay, to ensure that speaking activities work, and to try to push students a little bit more to use the opportunities that you give them to produce the language. As you're looking at them, all I'd like you to do with the people next to you, which of these do you regularly do? How do you think each of these things that we're looking at here tackle some of these problems that we've been discussing? Are there any that you just think, why on earth would you do that? That's mad, that's a waste of time. If so, we'll come back to those ones in a minute. Okay? Can you read those okay at the back? Yeah? Okay, so with the people next to you, which of these do you do? Why? How do you think they tackle some of these problems? Any that you'd never do? Give you a few minutes. Okay, can I stop you there? Are there any from this lot that you're not sure of or that you have strong feelings against or you want me to say anything else about?
Yeah.
Tell me.
The use of L1.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your teaching context, okay? I think this is something I realised. I worked in Indonesia as my first job. And I think, in a way, if you're teaching particularly in a monolingual situation where students share the same first language, or if you're working in a kind of multilingual situation and you've got blocks of students who share the first language, in a way, particularly when you're doing more kind of creative tasks like the role play, you're basically asking students to do two things at once. You're asking them to generate ideas and to think about how to verbalize those ideas in English. So I think in a way, it's very similar for me to the idea of just getting the students to write notes and to look up words that they're not sure of in a dictionary. It's basically a kind of little stage where they generate the ideas first and they do it in a way that's comfortable to them, and then they use that as a stepping stone onto actually thinking about the language that they're going to use to express those ideas. So I think it's generally level dependent. For me, I was generally using that with sort of elementary, pre-intermediate kind of students, and using it more for tasks where I thought they were asked to actually think about ideas or think about creative kind of stuff first, because it's a sort of safe space in which they can come up with those ideas in whatever language is easiest for them to come to those ideas, and to then use that as a way to kind of get onto the language that they're looking for. So it's just a kind of scaffold, in a sense, to allow them to get onto that stage easier. And obviously, if you share the language with the students, even better. Not always going to be the case in a lot of teaching contexts you guys are in, but it might be you've got 3 Spaniards, 3 Arabic speakers, a group of Turks or whatever.
A one-to-one context?
One-to-one context as well, I think, because in a way what you then do is you kind of use that student's L1 and you say, okay, now tell me what you think that says in English, and you work from that. And you kind of go, yeah, I know what you mean this. Yeah? It may just be some things they get completely stuck on, and you go on Google Translate and you get a crap version of what they're trying to say, and then you help them say that better. But I think it's providing that little bit of safe space for them where they can basically get some ideas down first. Tell me.
I was just wondering, if they had, I find this idea so interesting, if they had some notes or something in their first language,
yeah,
when they repeated it in L2, would you get them to kind of cover it? What I'm worried about is them then getting into the habit of doing very clunky word-for-word translation. How would they, because I totally agree with keeping the ideas separate.
Yes.
Because otherwise they do a weird backwards thing where they try and use language before they've actually thought of the ideas. But would you get them to kind of cover or put aside maybe the L1?
If they're low level, basically what they're going to be doing anyway is doing clunky L1 translation. They're going to be speaking Turkish in English, or French in English, or Arabic in English, or whatever.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I think, to begin with, first time around, no. What you might then do is next lesson, you might basically do the same role play again, and you can say, okay, you've got 1 minute, have a look at your L1 notes quickly. Okay, cover it up, now see if you can remember the English. Because what you're then doing is you're bypassing or shortcutting the natural process that those students are going through anyway, as they're coming from L1 and thinking about how to say that stuff in L2. And I think it's much better dealt with at phrasal level or sentence level or discourse level than it is as just kind of looking up the odd random single word. Yeah? So I think, you can move towards that ideally. Yeah? Was there anything else there you wanted? Any other thoughts on? One other thing about getting speaking from students is always wait 5 seconds longer than you think you need to after you've asked a question. Because, there's always someone at the back who's sort of ruminating. Except this time. Okay. A few more things, okay? Other things that teachers might do to kind of help students get a bit more from the speaking. Same thing, I'll give you 2 more minutes, yeah? Which do you regularly do? Which do you just think, what's he on about here? I don't get the point of that. Okay, give you a couple more minutes. Can I stop you there again? Again, were there any that you're not sure of or you'd like me to say anything else about? Is that you raising your hand, Howard, or are you just stretching?
Yeah.
Tell me.
The third one.
Yeah, it's always the third one. Yeah, okay.
I'm getting kind of disturbed about the idea of concept checking Brexit as a general concept.
Yeah, bad idea generally.
Bad idea. And the amount of system-related language that a good, well-placed question adds to anything in Brexit.
So I'll just say a little bit about that then in that case, yeah? I think in a way it's often kind of, it's teaching things that come before the speaking with a view to scaffolding or providing language that you think will be useful for when the students do the speaking, okay? So say you're doing a phrasal verb exercise and you've got things like, fall out with, okay? And you know that one of your speaking tasks later is, has anyone ever fallen out with anyone? Which is a much better question than, have you ever fallen out with anyone, okay? Because it allows you space to go, well, actually, yes, I fell out with my dad about fucking Brexit last year. I'm sure I'm not alone in this. It allows you to kind of think about how might you get some language to help the students with this. So what you do is when you're going through in the vocab exercise that precedes the speaking, you kind of go, right, so number 3, that's right, fell out with my brother about money. And then you might just ask, and if you fall out with your brother about money, Why? What might happen? Yeah, okay, so you might lend him some money, he never pays you back. And when you fall out, usually what happens? Yeah, you have a big row, you stop speaking, okay? Any other reasons why you might fall out? So you're sort of asking these questions, as Howard was saying, to sort of generate language around the language you're looking at. You might then get, yeah, you can fall out about a guy, you can fall out about a girl. Why? What happens in that situation? You both fancy the same person, one ends up going out with them. You have a big row, you stop talking, they split up, you make up, everything's okay now. And you might write some of this extra language up. So then, when it comes to, has anyone you know ever fallen out with anybody? They might just say, yes, me and my best friend when we were 16, we fell out about a girl, we fell out about a guy. He fancied her, I fancied her, he got her, we had a big row, we stopped talking, but it's okay, we've made up now. You've basically kind of given those students the language to say what they want to say by thinking ahead as you're doing the vocab exercise and looking at some of the language around the language you're teaching that might help the students as they come to do their own speaking. So, I mean, I think it's really important, and it's much better to do that than to kind of say, is fallout positive or negative? It's negative. And if you fall out, do you get on with someone now? No, you don't. Because that gives you nothing. You know, that gives you no extra language, no extra contexts, no extra kind of scaffolding to help you do your own kind of speaking. Yeah? Was there anything else there that you wanted any other thoughts on?
What do you do when you're doing a tour of the class and two of them are sitting there not actually doing the class?
I kind of go, hi, what's your name? And you say?
Tana.
Tana, and what's your name?
Paul.
Paul. So Tana, meet Paul. I'd like you to just meet each other. Hope you're going to be very happy together. I'll come back in 2 minutes and I hope you'll be talking to each other. Just that to begin with. I mean, basically just kind of take the piss out of them and let them know that I've noticed that they're not talking and push them a little bit together. And if they're still sitting there, kind of go, right, so Tana, tell me, have you ever fallen out with it? Yeah, right, so there you go, off you go, and walk away. And just kind of gently cajole them into doing that. Doesn't always work, but it works more often than it doesn't. And I think, you know, it's letting them know that you've noticed and that you're not happy about it. And sometimes just sort of putting a little bit of pressure on them like that. Yeah. And then maybe cutting it short. And then maybe next time changing them around and thinking you two don't work together very well. Yeah. Yeah, the other thing I'll just say a little bit about is the repetition thing, because I think often we don't do enough repetition in language teaching generally. There's a sort of fear of, we've done that already, tick, let's move on. But actually, you know, any of you who've learned a language outside of the classroom, you know how much of that is to do with endless repetition and having the same conversation over and over and over again and just getting better at that conversation because you learn more language to have that conversation. And I think the repetition's a really good thing to do, provided they're getting extra input every time based on what they're doing. So for me, a lot of the time, that's how I'll begin the next class, is to kind of say, okay, stand up, walk around, talk about that thing we talked about at the end of last class, better than you did last time, using some of the new language we looked at, okay, with a different partner, go. It's still interesting because you're talking to someone different, you're retelling a story or an emotion or a thought or an opinion that you've got. You're trying to integrate some of the new language that you got as feedback, and at the end, you'll get more feedback based on your output this time. So I think, you know, more repetition and more layering of what students can do with their language when they're having certain kinds of conversations is really important, particularly if it's the kind of conversation they're actually going to have out there, where the classroom becomes a kind of dry run or a safe space for them to have that kind of conversation. I think one of the other sort of main things to think about is what kind of input are you going to give the students based on what they say, okay? I don't know how many of you know this kind of Scott Thornbury idea of dogma teaching, teaching unplugged, where you're kind of working from what the students say. I think it's a lovely idea, but it's really bloody difficult to do, because what you sort of need to do is you need to be A, getting the students speaking, B, listening to them all kind of as they're speaking and wandering around and cajoling the people who aren't speaking. C, noticing gaps in their language. D, thinking about how to say those things better in a more sophisticated way. E, getting that language on the board in some kind of way while they're still talking, thinking about what you're going to gap on the board, thinking about what questions you're going to ask with it, thinking about how you're going to get the students to use some of that language, and you're having to do all of that on the spot. I mean, it's a huge ask for teachers to sort of engage in, I think, and it's one of the reasons why basically Dogme doesn't exist outside of Scott Thornberry's head a lot of the time, I think. And I think one of the real problems is it's really difficult to do without cheating, okay? And my own feeling is cheat in this particular kind of instance. And for me, anytime I'm doing a speaking, whether it's in a course book or something that I know we're going to be talking about in the classroom, I will look at that for a couple of minutes before I go into the class, and I will predict some of what I think students might say, okay? And it's basically just doing the task yourself in your head. It's thinking about what you would say, thinking about what you think students might say. And when you're doing this, sometimes you see flaws with the exercises. Sometimes you might think, oh, there's going to be loads to say about this. In what way is life like a jigsaw? It's a big question. Then you sit and try and answer it yourself, and you think, do you know what? I have no idea what I would say in response to this. I saw Michael Swan the other week and do a talk in Spain TESOL. And one of his tasks was, think of something unbelievable or something ridiculous that you used to believe. For example, when I was 3, I used to believe that fireworks were burning men flying across the sky. And I sat there and I just thought, stupid things I used to believe. You know, Tooth Fairy, everyone believes that. Father Christmas, everyone believes that. You know, my parents were perfect, everyone believes that. The scales fall from your eyes. But basically, I couldn't think of anything. So for me, just thinking about what I might say about this task is one way of thinking it's not actually a very good task and I might need to adapt this. And, you know, as it says here, I think sometimes when you do the tasks, you realise you might need to tweak a task or to change a task or to maybe give the students, here are some crazy things that kids sometimes believe, which did you used to believe? And scaffold it a little bit more, just to kind of provoke a little bit more discussion, because otherwise it might fall flat. Sometimes you might find that there's a lot to say, okay? And because there's so much to say, students potentially may be unable to say a lot of those kinds of things. What you then might want to think about is, okay, if I'm going to teach some of this language that students might need to say, how am I going to do it? It might be that I can pre-teach some of that language through a previous vocabulary exercise or grammar exercise or reading exercise. It might be that you give your own model before the students do their own speaking and you use some of this new language in your own model. It might just be that it helps you to hear better. So when students try to say something, you might be better primed to hear what they're trying to say because you thought of that before. And you might hear them say something and you go, oh yeah, I know what you mean this. And the students sort of think, wow, you know, how did you do that? So, well, because I predicted that you might say this before the class, and therefore I'm better able to hear that and better able to kind of feed you the language that you might need here. And, you know, you might just be better able also to help the students as they're trying to prepare. If you're giving them a couple of minutes preparation time and they're asking you, how do you say this thing on your arm? You might go, oh yeah, so you've got a scar. And you're able to do that immediately because you've had a little think about the things that they might say in advance, okay? Yeah, so what I'd like you to do, okay, I'm just going to ask you to think about one particular task here. What I'd like you to do is just to think about what do you think might be said, okay? Don't just think of it in terms of grammar or single words. Think of it in terms of whole sentences or whole phrases that you think students might say. You might just want to make a little mental note of some of the phrases that you think students might say. If you're doing it yourself as real lesson preparation, you might want to sort of write some of these sentences down in your course book or on a lesson plan or on your arm or whatever you do. It might be, if you really want to explore this stuff, you do the tasks yourself before you go in with a colleague. You actually sit and look at the language you really use to do these things, and you think, oh, that's interesting. I've never thought about teaching that phrase. We both used that when we did the task. That might be a good thing to feed in this particular kind of exercise. It might also be that you think, well, there's nothing to say about this. I need to change the task in some way. The one I think I'd like you to think about is, imagine you're teaching an intermediate level class and you've done some vocabulary about journeys. Maybe you've done a little lexical set about ways of travelling or something, and they're going to talk about bad journeys that they've had. Together with the people next to you, just try to make a list of things you think students might say at this level about bad journeys that they've had. Okay? Give you 2 minutes. Let's just see some of the ideas you've got. Tell me. Some of the things you think students might try to say about bad journeys they've had.
Lost luggage.
Yeah, so the airline lost my luggage, or they lost my luggage, or my luggage got lost, something like that. Again?
They say bad travel.
Ah, that's more like a mistake that they might make, yeah, as opposed to something that they might try to say. So they might, what they're trying to say is, I had a terrible journey, or it was an awful journey. Yeah, the delay? What might they say about the delay?
I lost. Another one, I lost my bus.
Okay, so there might be this whole thing about I missed my bus, I missed my train, I missed my connection. Okay? Yeah, we got held up, we got delayed, I got stuck in the airport for 10 hours, I got stuck on the train for 10 hours, we got stuck in traffic for 10 hours.
We're thinking also about stuff about get, there's lots of collocations with get and keep probably, which they wouldn't be able to produce, like get lost, get stressed, get stuck.
We got lost, we got stuck in the airport.
Keep driving and driving, we had to keep going round and round.
Okay, we kept going round and round in circles, yeah. I kept asking people, no one knew where it was, there's all of that. So again, I think with those, the important thing is think about the whole sentence that they might actually say.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me.
Karina said that we didn't think about maybe the responses from the other students.
Ah, so there might be this whole extra thing in the conversation of, oh, that must have been awful. Oh, that must have been terrible. God, what did you do? What happened in the end? Yeah, so thinking also about not just the story, but the responses is really, really useful, I think. And this is where sometimes when you record it with a partner, you suddenly notice, oh, there's all this other stuff that's not just a monologue. Yeah, and it's really good to think about that as well, I think, because often we don't teach that. And when you're modelling it, it's really hard to model that because you're giving a kind of monologue. Yeah? Okay, so I think the important thing is to sort of think about all of these things in terms of things you might actually say. It may be based on problems that you know students are going to have, like my travel was awful, I lost my train, that kind of thing. And thinking about what they actually mean when they say that. It might be there's going to be all this collocational stuff with get and keep. For example, this, and this. Again, when you think about different bad journeys, what you might say about a bad plane journey is often going to be really different to what you say about a bad car journey. Bad car journey, we broke down in the middle of nowhere. We didn't speak the local language, we didn't know who to call, we didn't have travel insurance, it took ages for us to flag down another car. Bad train journey, we broke down just outside the station, the carriages were really crowded, it was really hot and stuffy. So it's thinking about each of those possible stories and what they might actually say. And I think in a way, thinking about this language is the main step that you then need to kind of give the student some input that will help them do their own speaking better. One way you can do this is through your own model before students actually do a task. And modelling is quite a strange thing because we generally think about modelling in terms of grammar. We think about it in terms of kind of modelling a model sentence, like, I've broken my leg, everybody. But actually, I think giving students a model of the kind of speaking that you want them to do before they do it is a really, really important kind of thing. Because on one level, what you're doing is you're presenting them some language that might be useful to them. You're showing them, I don't just want you to do a kind of yes/no answer. When you've got these kind of things like, discuss 8 have you ever questions, there's a real temptation for students to kind of whiz through them and go, have you ever been to Paris? Yes, I have. Have you ever broken your leg? Yes, I have. Have you ever done it? Yes, I have. Finished! What do we win? You're like, you win the bloody annoying student of the day award. And in a way, that's a sort of obvious thing for students to do because they're going to take a minimum risk because they're scared of making mistakes. They want to just get this out the way as quickly as possible. They don't realise that you're asking them to do this because you want them to actually have a real conversation about it. They think you're asking them to do this because it's a grammar practice and you're looking for mistakes. And maybe you are. If you are, maybe you need to rethink that. Maybe what you can do is to get them to ask you a couple of questions first. You give your own answers. You go a long way beyond the yes, I have, no, I haven't. You give extra information. And then you put them together and say, okay, so in pairs, your answers like this. Yeah, bit of body language there. You like that? Yeah, thank you. Pass. Yeah. And, I think what that then does is it pushes them a little bit more. And just getting in the habit of doing this yourself, I think, is really, really important. It may be with some things you might model the conversation with another student. So, you might tell your story of a terrible journey. You might stop and kind of go, and the student sits and goes, terrible. And you go, yeah, I know. That must have been terrible. That must have been terrible. It was. Okay? And then you stop again. What happened? Yeah, so what happened in the end? Good question, thank you for asking. And you can kind of get a little bit of that from working with one of the better students in the class. I think the advantages of modelling are sort of numerous in a way. You're showing the students what you want them to do beyond simple yes/no answers. I think sometimes it can sort of just make clear to the students the reason why they're doing this task. If what you're doing when you're giving your own model is sort of using some of the language that's been pre-taught, you're showing them, so the reason we're doing this is so that you can embed some of that new language in what you've already got and you can practice using some of that new language. It might be that you write some of the new language on the board. As you're speaking sometimes, you might just see students' faces kind of do that wrinkly thing. You can kind of go, yeah. So we got stuck in a terrible traffic jam. Like when you're traveling by plane, we got stuck at the airport for 10 hours anyway, and then you carry on. Or it might be that you just use your voice to emphasize that stuff. When students realize this is what you're doing, they often start taking notes based on your own model, and you hear them reusing some of that language themselves as they're trying to tell these stories themselves. I think on top of that, it also just buys students time, okay? It may be if you say, okay, in pairs, tell each other about a bad journey. You sort of go, don't know, you start. I don't know, you start. No, you start. If you just tell your own story for a couple of minutes, it allows the students to think, oh yeah, something like that happened to me once. Or, oh, something different happened to me, but now I've suddenly thought of it. I think also it sort of just humanises you. It makes the students realise that, you're an interesting person with your own life stories. I heard about the train story in China over here, so already I'm thinking, oh, you've been to China, you had a problem on a train, tell me what happened. Those are the kinds of things that I think endear you to students and sort of make you a bit more real to the students as people. Maybe you might want to also use one of the students as an example. So it might be kind of, so go on, give me your story about China. Right, so that journey. And you sort of tell it collaboratively like that together. And then you put the students in groups. Now tell each other about your bad journeys. Yeah. So you can also use student examples like that. I'm not going to ask you to do one now, but the one I was thinking of, and you can do it yourself with your partner, ties into the earlier talk. If you're going to do your wonderful cover lesson about a scar, great thing to do with a partner, sit there, tell each other scar stories, go through the dialogue of your scar stories and try to decide the language that you both use that could be useful to anyone telling a scar story. Obviously, some scar story language will be specific. You know, this pissed bloke came into a bar and started picking around through an ashtray. Quite specific, okay? There was blood everywhere. We had to call an ambulance. He had his wound stitched up. Quite general, yeah? Oh, God, that sounds horrible. Quite useful, quite general. So what you start to think about when you do those kinds of preparing yourself for the model is which language is more universal, which language is more specific? Can I get more of the universal language into my own model? So if I'm going to sort of ask you to talk about bad journeys that you've had, I might begin by saying, for example, for me, it may or may not be true, okay? I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter. Or it may be true with a little bit of extra added language. You know, the first time I flew back from Indonesia to England, I flew with Aeroflot. It was the worst journey of my life, okay? You know, first, we got delayed in the airport for 10 hours. I was stuck there waiting for the plane. Nobody gave me any information. Then, we made an unscheduled stopover in Almaty in Kazakhstan. Then we got stuck for another 10 hours. You know, and you build in some of the things that you've already thought might be useful for everybody into your own particular model. The last thing I'd really like to talk about is once you've got this language and once you've thought about the things that students might actually say, what it also helps you do, apart from prepare your model, is prepare your post-speaking feedback. And I know this is one of the ways I've changed myself drastically as a teacher. When I first started teaching, I think, after student speaking, I was usually so stunned that students had actually been speaking for 10 minutes. I'd just sort of stop and go, that was great, you all spoke in sort of really crap English, but it was great anyway. I must be a very student-centred teacher, well done you. Then I started thinking, yeah, but they're making loads of grammar mistakes. So then what I would do is to sort of note down 20 grammar mistakes, stop them and say, that was great, you did some speaking, but you made 20 grammar mistakes, I've written them all on the board, in pairs correct them for the next half an hour. And it would sort of make the students even more neurotic about grammar than they were already. And probably even less likely to actually talk next time than they had been before. Now, the way I sort of view this post-student talk is it's an opportunity to help the students to say some things either they were trying to say or they could have been trying to say better, okay? And I think the important thing is that there's something that you give them at the end of the speaking that helps them to speak. You know, it's in a way it's teaching forward. It's teaching towards the next time they talk about something similar. So for me now, at the end of a student speaking activity, usually what I'll do is, okay, so stop there. Heard some really interesting things. Let's look at how to say some of those things better, which is a very different kind of psychological message to the students, okay? On the board, I'll probably have a list of sentences, almost always whole sentences or little dialogues. Maybe a couple of errors, usually generally not errors, usually actually just things that I think they were trying to say, but they couldn't say as well as they should. And some of those will be things that I've heard students say where I've sort of gone, yeah, I know what you mean, written it on the board. Some of them will be things that I've prepared up my sleeve from my own predicting of what I think students will say, because I'm worried that I might not have time in the class to actually hear enough. And when you say, I heard someone say, students will never ask you, who said that? It just doesn't happen, basically. Students realise you're playing a little kind of game with them. And really what you're doing is you're recycling grammar you've already taught, you're recycling vocabulary you've already taught, you're helping them to say things that they said or that they might want to say better. And that's a really invaluable kind of thing, because where do you get that from outside of a classroom? You know, often when you're speaking a foreign language with friends outside in the street or in the pub, basically your friends understand you. They make allowances for you because you're foreign. They sort of go, yeah, I know what you mean. You know, it's a weird friend actually who stops you in the pub and says, I know what you mean, but actually what you mean is blah, 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 blah. Yeah. It's great talking to you, thank you. You know, it's not actually what you want in a social context. So being able to have that in a classroom where the teacher listens to you and rephrases or reformulates your language is a really, really useful thing, I think. And as I said, what it allows you to do is to kind of go over things you've taught already. Sometimes it allows you to focus on new aspects of vocabulary you've already taught. Sometimes, if you've prepared it and you've thought about it before, it allows you to focus on more complex language than you would if you were just working from the students. Often, if you're only working from the students, you notice the basic mistakes. You notice the present perfect mistake and you wheel out your present perfect explanation again. And the students kind of go, yeah, I know, 25 times, I still can't use it, but you carry on, teacher, with your timelines and your bloody grammar practice. Sometimes it might allow you to look at negative evidence as well. It may allow you to sort of predict, I reckon they're going to say this, I reckon it's worth looking at this, because this is a common mistake, we can pick up on this and we can explore this. I'll skip all that bit, and I'll skip that bit. And I think the bit I'm going to look at is this, okay? When you're doing the feedback, I think what it means you can do is you can focus on different aspects of things. As I said, I think the best way to do it is gap sentences. And I think it might be that you focus on grammar. So it might be you hear students say something like, I am sure it was him who was the responsible. And you go, yeah, so he must have had something to do with it. Let's gap that, see if they can remember that. You might hear another student say, it is a long time since I didn't see him. And you think, yeah, so I haven't seen him for ages. There might be another student who says, you know, the economy booms. And you're thinking, no, it's not, it's this, okay? So you might get this up on the board. And once you've got this, I think, you can just ask them, what are the missing words? You can give them a couple of minutes in pairs. Can you work out the missing words? Can you correct it? Or you might sometimes have to kind of paraphrase it. So you might have to say, yeah, so I heard some of you say, this guy, I'm sure, 99%, he was responsible. So I'm sure he must had something to do with it. Anyone? Well done, that's right. He must have had something to do with it. And I haven't seen him. Last time I saw him 3 years ago or 4 years ago, a long time ago. So I haven't seen him, not since. I haven't seen him since 2012. I haven't seen him for ages. Good, just checking. And here, the economy booms at the moment. Yeah, not always, so at the moment, so it's booming. Good. It might also be that you just choose to focus on vocabulary instead, or a mixture of the two, yeah? So it might be that you're looking at, okay, so some of you were talking about the economy, it's doing really well, there's building work everywhere, new businesses are opening up, yeah, there's a lot of jobs being created. So the economy's really, you might give the first letter. Yeah, B. If no one gets it, just give it to them. This was one of my students came up with recently. In London, it's very strange. You see a lot of people smoking marijuana, but the police, they just ignore. So yeah, I know what you mean. They turn a to it. You might do a little bit of acting. You know, students going to go, dead eyes, blind eyes. And you go, yeah, for some weird reason, it's only one eye. This is the limitations of miming. You know, they turn a blind eye to it, and you kind of elicit that from the students. And I think when you're doing this kind of thing all the time after student speaking, it's a much better way of thinking about developing grammar competence, actually, because what they're getting is all the grammar all the time, basically, because they're going to try and use the present perfect sometimes, they're going to use the present continuous sometimes. They may use the past simple a little, past perfect a little bit. They may use other structures a little bit. And what you're doing is sort of working with those gaps and helping them to say these things better. 1 minute, what am I doing with this? Yeah, so what I'd like you to think about, okay, the last little task. Imagine that you're doing an exercise. The students have done a little role play where they're giving each other good news and bad news. And here's some language that you've predicted they might try to say beforehand. You've got your sentences. This is what you're going to write on the board, but you're going to gap it, okay, with the people next to you, just decide what would you gap, what would you say to the student to get this from them? Okay? Give you a few minutes. Okay, I'll stop you there because I'm running out of time. In a way, there's no correct answer to this, okay? There are arguments for gapping different things, and when I've done this with different teachers from different nationalities, often they'll pick different aspects because of the problems that they know their students will have with particular things. It may be, if you're teaching Spanish kids, the word pregnant is the problem because in Spanish the word for pregnant is embarazada, okay? So, you know, they'll often kind of go, I'm very embarrassed, or she is embarrassed. And you go, why? She's going to have a baby. It's nothing to be ashamed of. You know, what's the problem? So it may be that you get this and say, so, my news, guess what? Cue for the students to go, you're fat. Yeah, thank you. No, I'm a woman. Yeah, you're a fat woman. No, it's a baby. Ah, you're embarrassed. No, in Spanish, yes. In English, that's right, I'm pregnant. It may just be things like it. Because, you know, that's quite weird, actually. Most languages will have a gendered version of this. The baby will be a he or a she. A lot of languages, the baby, by definition, is a he for some sexist reason, yeah? It may just be you gap that, or you gap that and that. And you kind of go, oh, congratulations. So when, and the students will kind of go, when the baby will come out, when the baby will appear. And you go, yeah, so when's it due? And the students go, what, like a bus? And you go, yes, it's the same question. Weird, I know. Don't ask me. With some of them, it may be you gap things like to, okay? Because lots of students will say going in Mexico, okay? So it may just be, yeah, so did I tell you this summer I'm going? Ah, not in your language, yes. In English, to. So I think the important thing is you gap something and you think about how you're going to get that word. For me, usually, I mean, I'll probably gap that because a lot of students will go for look like, okay, instead of look. Or I might gap that because I know I've taught it in a previous lesson. I want to see if they can remember it. I might gap that because a lot of students will say have a surgery, okay, depending on who I'm teaching. The important thing is that you've got something that you think is problematic for your students, and you've got this stuff up your sleeve, you've got this stuff on the board, and when the students finish speaking, there's a kind of goal to the speaking, which is, and now we're going to look at how to say some of that stuff better, and the students have a chance to look at this, they have a chance to write it down. For me, it's important they write it. I'm sure a lot of your students will also just do this and take a photo. Not okay, I think, much better for them to write it. Because if they're writing it, I mean, A, there's some sort of research that suggests the writing it helps the memory. B, they're actually taking their time and looking at it and thinking about it a bit more in a way that just taking a photo doesn't help them to do. Sorry, I've just called someone by accident, 1 minute. Police. So giving them the time to sort of just, it's downtime as well. It's like you've had all this speaking, you've had the teacher at the board, you've had all the interaction and the elicitation. There's a little bit of downtime for them to write things down, for them to record. There will always be one student who just writes look plus adjective, and you go around and go, no, write the whole thing. Why? Because you can't say it and I can, so write it, okay? Yeah, it also just allows them a bit of thinking time, and they might suddenly go, so what's the difference between operation and surgery? And you go, oh, it's a good question. Lucky I thought of that before the lesson, and you give your little answer. So it's a chance for the student to sort of digest and process and ask extra questions. Typically, I've massively overplanned. But there's some good news, okay? If you want copies of the whole slides with all the extra stuff that I didn't have time to squeeze into what I now realise is much less time than I thought I had, please just email me. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. Very happy to send you on a copy of the slides and some connected kind of stuff. We also have this website, lexicallab.com, where we sort of blog about teaching and do words of the day for students and that kind of thing. And if any of you do that Facebook thing, it's there. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention, and I'll stop there bang on 9 o'clock.